question, parties in council are present, who is the jury present, witness dropping the witness stand, and Mr. McGee, you may continue your examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, on direct and earlier in cross, you talked about CODIS and what it was. Remember that part of the testimony?
Yes, sir.
Now, there are certain requirements to enter in some kind of DNA analysis of a suspect, either a known person or a suspect, in the CODIS, correct? For comparison with the system.
The profiles that we put into CODIS are not suspect profiles. They are actually profiles that are derived from the evidence of a potential perpetrator. There's a distinct difference there. When we get suspect reference samples in, we're not allowed to put them into the system. Really, we're interested in putting in evidential DNA results that may assist an investigation in determining who the perpetrator may be.
So an example would be, let's say you have a rape kit and you develop a DNA profile of an unknown individual. And you could enter that in the CODIS, and then if there's a hit later or a similar profile that's connected with another case somewhere else, they could say, these might be related, these might be similar circumstances. It's an investigative tool.
Yes, sir. If we have reason to believe that the profile we developed from the evidence may have come from the perpetrator, that's correct.
And for those type of samples to be entered in, the lab that did the processing has to fulfill all the FBI guidelines.
Yes, sir. That's my understanding.
And contained also in CODIS, if somebody's convicted of a felony and their DNA is collected and a profile is obtained, that could be put in the system. So you have people to test perpetrators against.
That is done by the state laboratory. They are responsible for what's called the convicted offenders file. I believe they also take certain arrestee samples in California and place them into the same index.
So if my client was arrested in this case and his profile was put into the state system, but you said you didn't get a result match from the F38 sample that you put into CODIS.
Well, I honestly say I am not aware of a match, but I must kind of put a caveat in that I believe your client was arrested after I retired, so I really wouldn't know.
Okay, fair enough. Is there something also called a one-time keyboard search?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Again, I am not the I'm not the current, and actually hadn't been for quite a while, the current CODIS administrator. I do know that there is such a thing as a keyboard search. I am not really familiar with the mechanisms of it. Our CODIS administrator would have a better handle on that.
Do you know if a one-time keyboard search is something to where information is not being uploaded into CODIS, you're just seeing if what you have compares with what's already there?
That's my understanding of how a keyboard search works, is that it's a one-time shot. Take a look at the information that is in CODIS at this moment, and a survey is done, and the profile that is used to query the database is not retained in the database. That's my understanding, in general.
And for somebody to do a one-time keyboard search, you still have to be an authorized user or administrator of CODIS.
I believe it probably would be something directed by our local CODIS administrator, but now you're getting probably a little bit past. I really have not ever explored that, so I don't know.
What I'm saying is, I can't go online as Joe Public and say, oh, I have a profile, I want to see if it's in CODIS, right?
I believe that would not be allowed.
Right. You have to be somebody who's licensed under the CODIS administration protocols to actually have access to it.
352 Lax Foundation.
Sustained on relevance, grounds and evidence, code 352.
The one-time keyboard search profile that's being punched in, are there any requirements or protocols on how the profile was developed for a one-time keyboard search?
Same objection.
Overruled.
I believe it would be that it would be a profile that itself was developed using approved methods. With regard to the amount of DNA information and so forth, I don't know. In other words, if it were a partial profile, I don't know what the standards are.
So you're not familiar with the protocol says you have to have at least 8 identified.
That's the thing to which I am referring. I know that there are some minimum standards for that with regard to either a partial profile or to a mixture profile. I just don't know what they are. I may have known them at one time.
If in a case the defense was to submit a DNA profile presented by a certified lab, could the government run it?
Objection, incomplete hypothetical, Lax Foundation, 352.
If there is an unknown profile developed in a case and presented to a law enforcement agency, and that profile was developed within the standards as required by an accredited lab, and it was a complete profile, could that profile be ran on a one-time search?
Same objections, 352 Lax Foundation. Incomplete hypothetical.
Overruled. He has some opinion.
The question is if I know. I don't know. I suspect our CODIS administrator would be aware of that. There are a number of issues with regard to controls that must be made or levels of confidence that must be met with regard to the abilities of particularly of private laboratories and their data. I'm just aware that there are some standards. I don't know what they are, and I certainly don't know what the procedures would be.
And do you have an opinion if you believe the bogey cell mark would likely meet those standards?
Objection, Lax Foundation.
Sustained is cumulative.
In reviewing all the documentation of this case, did you see that defense has provided DNA profile?
Objection, Lax Foundation calls for suit.
Sustained.
Items F39 and F41 that you noted were too complex to analyze? Ones that were possibly 4 individuals or more?
Out of F39 were 2 swabs of the front passenger indoor door handle, the power window, and the door locks. My opinion was that it was a mixture of DNA from at least 3 individuals. Excuse me, and it was too complex for me to make any sort of conclusions on. Item F40 were 2 swabs of the left rear passenger interior door handle, power window, and control.
I might have missed up 41.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right. Item 41 were 2 swabs of the right rear passenger interior door handle, power window control. There was a small, lower level of DNA recovered from that item, and the results indicated a mixture of at least 4 individuals, including 1 male. And again, the results were too complex for me to interpret.
Those samples, would those be good samples that your Crime Lab is meant to your STARMIC program to analyze?
Objection, Wax Foundation calls for speculation.
Overall, you can answer if you have some opinion.
Sir, I have not been trained in STARMICs, so I really don't know what samples would qualify for them and what the particular limits are for the use of that program. So I really don't feel qualified to answer any questions with regard to the application of STARMICs.
Fair enough. Thank you. I have nothing further.
Okay, you want to redirect?
Yes. I'm trying to get that before noon. You were asked some questions yesterday about several journals, some of which you'd heard of, most of which you heard of, some of which you weren't too familiar with. And you were asked questions about whether they're considered a reliable authority. Do you recall that line of questioning yesterday?
I do recall that.
Okay. Well, in the law, we have cases and we have statutes, and we have a set of facts, and we apply the facts to the law. Is that how science is? When you're presented with a DNA problem, do you immediately go to these authorities for an answer?
Not sure if I can make that. I'm quite honestly not sure exactly what you're getting at.
What are those journals? What's in them?
In the journals are reports of either research studies or case studies that have been done generally by forensic scientists or somebody in a related field. And they serve a purpose to kind of inform the community to what has been found and in some cases what can be done, in some cases what shouldn't be done, and so forth.
Do they constitute immutable laws of science?
I don't believe so. If that's what you're...
That's what I'm getting at.
No, sir. Basically what they do, they serve as to inform the community. I wouldn't say that they were standards to be held or things like that. No, sir. They are to inform the community of testing, of results, of research, of case studies, and so forth.
Okay. And sometimes those studies utilize a large sample size, right? Sometimes they use a smaller sample size.
Yes, sir.
How does that factor into what's published in these studies? In your mind as a scientist?
Generally those that have a large sample size have the potential to have a more powerful impact with regard to the interpretations and the conclusion. You have a smaller sample size, but you have quite a number of studies. And they all have small sample sizes, but they all develop their conclusions. That may also allow you to develop some sort of viewpoint or perspective. There are a lot of factors that go into interpreting the DNA results.
Have you ever interpreted degraded results with an analytical threshold of 5 RFUs?
Objection relevant.
Overruled.
Not for the purposes of casework. I believe that when we did the validation studies to try and understand the analytical threshold, we actually mechanically took a look at the lower level RFUs in order to understand the noise in the background. But that's about the only time I can think of that we would have done something of that nature, is to understand what a true analytical threshold should be in order to exclude the potential for incorrectly identifying a noise peak as an allele.
You talked a little bit about allelic drop in and drop out. Does that affect, or does that possibility of either one of those become greater with degraded DNA? Old, degraded DNA.
Yes, sir, it does, as well as low-level DNA.
You were asked several questions about how grip and gripping something tight versus gripping something loose would be, could affect transfer of DNA onto an item.
It's one of several factors. Yes, sir.
And the other factors are the shutter status of the person holding it, any number of things, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Would you say that if you were to grab a hammer, a sledgehammer, and beat somebody about the head, let's say 4 people about the head, that you'd have to hold on to that pretty tight?
I wouldn't know that from personal experience,
You have to make the assumption.
but it would seem like a logical assumption.
Okay. And the hammer, the swaps from the hammer that you examined in this case, you were only comfortable finding one X allele in that sample.
Well, objection is the foundation, is the location of swap and taken.
Well, we'll,
I was only comfortable with the data that indicated that there was X allele present. I had no comfort in interpreting that result.
And you were asked some questions about a yield, and you indicated there was no DNA yield in your report, and yet some kind of quantification showed some, one example was a .00043, I think it was. You recall that line of questioning?
Yes, sir, I do.
And you said, if you trust that number. What do you mean by that?
The quantifications test that we do involves the analysis of a set of standard or known DNA concentrations. And from this standard of concentrations, you can get what's called a line, basically a standard curve line, in which you can estimate. If I have a standard curve line and then I have an unknown sample, I can then go to the standard curve line and kind of get an estimate of how much DNA is in that particular sample. In every one of the samples that I determined I could not really trust the data, the results that were obtained from the sample were well past the end of the curve. In essence, I didn't have a data point that low on standard curve to have confidence that it was properly indicating how much either human DNA or male DNA was present. Extremely low. I just didn't have confidence to say, yes, in fact, it's there.
Okay. So on that one example, .00043, I think it was, that's nanograms per microliter?
Correct.
What's a nanogram?
A nanogram is a unit of mass that is,
Is that 1
I'm not sure if that helps you, but that's what it is.
So 1 with 9 zeros?
Yes, 1 over 1 with 9 zeros.
That's 1/1000th of a gram?
I think that's about right.
So we're talking about .004 of 1/1000th of a gram per milliliter. Sound right?
It's been a while, so I've had to do a lot of fast math in my head, sir.
You and me both.
I'm simply comfortable with saying it's such a low level that I would not rely on the number,
Okay.
irrespective of whether it's nanograms or whatever. In the field of forensic DNA, if I get 1 nanogram of DNA from a sample, that's a good size amount. If I have an extract that has, and a lot of these extracts I may have recovered 48 or 50 microliters. If I multiply that 50 microliters times the value that you have suggested from my data, still winds up well under 1 nanogram. In fact, probably close to a picogram, which is 1,000th of a nanogram. And it's just too low to rely on.
How much DNA is in a cell?
One cell has, a diploid cell, a regular cell has about 6 picograms.
And a picogram is a 1,000th of a nanogram?
Correct.
good. You were asked several questions about your opinion with regard to the items from the grave. Any questions you were asked on cross about those items change your opinion?
Opinion regarding,
The recoverability of, or the representation of, let me phrase this correctly. You testified on direct that any possible alleles, any DNA you would get from that, in your opinion, would not be representative of what was there when it was put into the ground.
my opinion has not changed on that.
You were asked some questions about collection techniques. In particular, you were asked about MVAC. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yes, sir.
And you said that San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department has an MVAC.
Yes, sir.
And to your knowledge, at least when you left, were they utilizing the MVAC?
To my knowledge, when I left, we did not own the MVAC. The MVAC was, I know I received some training after I left in it, but I don't remember that it was there when I was employed.
And you still volunteer there now. Do they use it regularly now?
No, sir, they do not.
Why not, if you know?
It has not been fully tested in terms of operational procedures to be able to use it in casework.
How do you know that?
I actually had a chance to do a performance check study in which I, in parallel, sampled, I think there were about seven different items, in which I used the swab technique on one of the items, or one of the items, and the MVAC on the other. And the results indicated that more studies needed to be done with regard to how we use the MVAC before it could be relied upon as a DNA collection tool in our laboratory.
And in fact, didn't you conclude that at least the wet dry seemed to be better based on your small study that you conducted?
There were a couple of instances where the swab was better, usually on hard surfaces. It was on the porous surfaces that it appeared that the MVAC seemed to make a better recovery. But again, as you mentioned, it was a very small study. I will freely admit that it needs a lot of follow-up work on it.
Sure. But at least your initial conclusion was the wet dry swab technique performed better overall for amount of DNA recovery.
Yes, sir.
But more work needs to be done, more studies need to be done before the San Bernardino County Crime Lab can begin to put it into play. Is that
In
fair?
my opinion, absolutely, yes, sir.
And in fact, in the results with the MVAC, didn't you get alleles that didn't belong to either sample? Because you're aware of both known samples. And alleles appeared that didn't belong to those samples.
And in fact, my alleles were there. That's why it needs more work in order to develop a procedure, a process, a handling process, which would minimize or eliminate the handler from being present. As they say, it needs work.
Okay. You were asked about some studies that the defense counsel sent to me that I sent to you, right?
Yes, sir. I believe he may have sent them to me, but I did not have the access to the email address at the time.
Correct. And in particular, he asked you a hypothetical about one where if you shook hands, the defendant and the driver of the vehicle.
That's a good point. I do not.
Did you ever see him shake hands? You ever see that guy shake hands with Joseph McStay?
No, sir, I did not.
Okay. You and I have known each other a while, right?
Yes, sir.
Did we shake hands this morning?
Not that I recall.
Okay. Do you have any information of any interaction between Charles Merritt and Joseph McStay, as far as a physical interaction?
No, sir, I do not.
Okay. So when you were asked, is that reasonable, and you responded, I believe it is.
It was making the assumption that there had been that interaction.
Okay. You're not aware of any evidence of it, any interaction between the two of them, physical interaction?
No, sir, I'm not.
Shaking hands for 2 minutes, anything like that?
That's correct.
Can you sum up for us, at least the studies that you're familiar with regarding this touch DNA or the secondary transfer of touch DNA? I believe you did. You said you have to be cautious about it.
Yes, sir.
Well, you've been doing DNA a long time. Have you ever been able to confidently say where a piece of DNA came from? In other words, if you have to be cautious in your explanation of how it got there, aren't you always cautious in your explanation?
Yes, sir. As a matter of course, a DNA analyst will talk about the DNA that they found, describing the mechanisms and the different variables that can take place and get a different result.
Right, and that's why there's still ongoing studies on this. In fact, council brought up just last month or this year, one came out regarding this type of analysis.
That could be one of the reasons for additional studies. Yes, sir. The idea, the bottom line, as I explained to him, was to be aware of these potential explanations. Don't discard them. Be aware of them when you're doing your interpretation of how certain things got to be on an item.
Thank you very much. Nothing further.
Anything else?
Just a couple things, keep it brief. You have, I'll ask the first. On the study you did with the MBAC, you figured out pretty much procedures need to be developed if I can have the overhead. When you did it, everything in red is where your DNA was found.
Those are alleles consistent with my DNA profile. Yes, sir.
So it's safe to say you really didn't know how to use it.
Objection? Representative?
Overrule the minutes if you have an opinion.
That could be a conclusion if you'd like to draw that. I don't have any problems with you drawing that conclusion.
And you actually got your DNA when you did the wet-dry swabbing too, right?
Do you have a chart for that, sir? It's been a couple of years since I've done this study. Again, saying that there are that my alleles, those alleles that are consistent with me are in red. There's that potential. I don't know for a fact that I was contributed. There's only two. It's much more likely in the other table, excuse me, where there was quite a majority of those alleles appeared.
And the tables I was showing you, this was a report that you authored yourself, right?
That's correct.
So it's not I'm showing you something you've never seen.
It's something I wrote.
And you had no information about the interaction between my client and Mr. McStay, right? Do you have any evidence of my client ever driving that vehicle?
No, sir.
In the DNA interpretation that you finalized for this report, that's not conclusive proof that he drove either.
Again, that's not my position to make that assumption.
Nothing proof.
Anything else?
The other conclusion is it just doesn't work that well, right? The MVAC?
The object is foundation without being certified how to use it.
Sustained as you would. Anything else?
No.
One question. One of your first statements with regard to items from the grave, you said that you would not expect to find any DNA on any items buried for 3.5 years. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
That would represent those items at the time that they were buried.
Right. When you say that, if some of the by either animal activity or weather, and then were exposed to the elements not being buried for some period of time, would that, what effect, if any, would that have on your opinion about being able to find DNA that you could compare on such items?
My opinion would still be that DNA on those items would not represent what it was like 3.5 years prior. They may have a higher probability of some DNA being deposited on them
So,
just because of their availability from some other.
DNA being deposited on them subsequent to the time that they were initially buried.
Yes, sir.
The way you phrased your first opinion, that any DNA would not represent what was on them when they were in the ground, is it your opinion if there were DNA found on those items, it would have been deposited subsequent to the initial burial?
And I would object to foundation and
Oh, really? That's one of the advantages of sitting here. Although, as you've seen, I have seen some of those, but
My opinion is that if you are to analyze samples that have been buried for 3.5 years, number one, I expect all the biological processes would have basically destroyed all of the proteins, the DNA, and so forth that were originally on those items. If you get DNA results after you've unearthed them and so forth, I doubt that it represents what was on those items when they were buried. In a most extreme case, if some of the DNA survived, I would expect it to be DNA from the tissues that were around those items. When you talk about a body has a tremendous amount of DNA in it compared to some DNA that was left by simply touching. If I cannot even detect the massive amounts of DNA that would have been there in the tissues because it has been decomposed or degraded, basically wiped away, I would expect those same processes to have worked on a much smaller amount of DNA that may have been present on the surface of those items. So the request to look for this trace amount or touch DNA, in my opinion, was futile. To expect anything that you got from the grave to represent that touch.
so if you were asked a hypothetical question that there was an analysis, a DNA analysis of items from the grave or the surrounding area, and there was DNA found that certain alleles could be identified.
Yes, sir. What would my response be to that?
Okay, let's go with that.
My response would be is first take a look at the data. The highest probability of those alleles should be with the victims. If anything survived, that's where the most amount of DNA is. If none of those results are consistent with originating from the victims, then I have absolutely no confidence that those results represent what was put in the ground 3.5 years prior. If some of them, if they do, I would be stunned.
So your opinion, if there was such a result, your opinion is that would have been more likely that that was something deposited subsequent to the burial?
Yes, sir. If you obtain DNA results from something that you've unearthed after being buried for 3.5 years, it's something that came onto the item after it was buried, or maybe even after it was unearthed. But it's my opinion that it did not survive for 3.5 years underground.
Okay. And same opinion, even if it was above ground unearthed by animal activity or weather or something for part of that time?
That is true.
I'm assuming,
I just have one question.
okay,
Your opinion there, but that the items were actually in contact with the victim.
Yes, sir.
And if they were not, would that mean that your opinion is not including that testing?
If they were not in contact with the victim's DNA, I would not expect you to get any DNA, especially if you're talking about a minor amount or trace DNA. I would not expect that to. Any results you got would not reflect touch DNA that was on an item that had been buried for 3.5 years.
anything else?
Yes. During this decomposition process, the cells are breaking down, right?
Yes, sir.
And essentially they become liquid at some point, right?
At some point in the process, the cells break. There is a lot of degradation that's going on. Your proteins are being broken down into amino acids. Your lipids are being broken down. Your sugars are being broken down. Your nucleic acids, DNAs, are being broken down. There are plenty of enzymes within the body that will assist doing that. There are also microbes that are usually present in the soils that will do that. All of this is facilitated by moisture. A lot of moisture could come from the body, but any moisture that is in the ground could also assist in these biological processes. Really, biological processes need water in order to be able to work.
Sure, but the body itself actually, have you seen a decomposed body before?
Yes, sir, I have.
Okay, there's liquid around it, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so if it's in the body, that liquid's going to go into the soil.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And it's going to seep down into the soil. Are you familiar with any studies regarding the length of DNA after decomposition?
Yes, sir. There was a study done at the Body Farm in Tennessee. It's a forensic facility in which they purposely bury bodies and then go back and test for all sorts of different things. One of the things that was done one time was to test the soil samples around the body to see if you could recover nuclear DNA.
Your Honor, unobjective on the question of no discovery on any studies they're referring to, so I can probably wrong.
So, and the reason they looked at the soil is because the liquid in the tissue is going to go into the soil.
Yes, sir. Their primary reason for doing that was to see if there was potential for it. If a body had been buried for a short amount of time in one place and then moved to another, could you identify the body as being in that first place for a period of time? Could there be an association there? What they found was that in general, after about 6 months' time, there's no DNA that can be recovered.
Again, limited study, limited sample size.
Yeah, I think they only looked at 2 bodies, and both of them exhibited that characteristic.
Thank you very much.
Just one question about clarification. So what they were testing was the dirt looking for DNA afterward?
Yes, sir.
Any objections to Mr. Jones being excused?
Subject to recall, I suspect we'll see him back.
Okay. I'm assuming they know where to find you if they need you.
I'm afraid so, yes.
Thank you for your attendance, and you're excused from the courtroom at this time, subject to recall, and we'll go ahead and take our recess at this time at 1:30 this afternoon. Keep in mind the admonitions previously given to you, not to form or express any opinions about the case, not to discuss the case, and we'll see everyone back at 1:30.